Today we pay tribute to the master assassin, lover boy, and all-round nice guy, the one and only Ezio Auditore. As most of you may know, the Assassin's Creed board game is based on a series of video games that feature the main character Ezio, a young brash Italian noble who eventually became one of the most iconic characters in the entire franchise. I've always been a huge fan of the Ezio series of games since it was launched about 12 or 13 years ago, and even have some collectibles such as this Ezio figure, which unfortunately I will not be able to use in my game. Although not a main player character in the board game, I did want to give some special attention to him, and so in this video we are going to be painting with some slightly more advanced methods and techniques.
Va bene, I can do that.
When I got my Ezio model, he looked like he had a little too much of that Venetian wine and was leaning to one side. This can happen with plastic figures, but don't worry as there is an easy fix. What we're going to do is get some boiling hot water and soak the mini right up until about its ankles, which will soften the plastic and allow us to reposition the model as we like. Once the model is in the position you want, put the model in some room temperature water to cool down the plastic and allow it to harden again. With that simple step, Ezio is all sobered up and standing tall.
It is perfect.
I'm also going to clean up some of the mold lines before I start painting. The sculpt is mostly pretty clean, but there are some mold lines and flash around the boots, cape, and hidden blades. For a special character, a few minutes spent cleaning and filing away these mold lines and flash will go a long way towards getting a nice clean finish for display.
This only hurts for a while, brother. Like so many things.
For this model, we are starting with a black undercoat to try and get more dramatic shadows. Instead of using a spray can, I am going to use an airbrush for the zenithal highlights, and for my first coat, I am using Sombre Grey. Remember to properly thin down your paints when airbrushing to avoid clogging the brush. It's difficult to give an exact measurement of thinner to paint, but the consistency that you want is something like this. So we start applying the zenithal highlight by spraying the model at about a 45-degree angle so that the higher areas catch the color, leaving shadows in the recesses. We apply thin coats of paint one by one, giving each previous layer just a few seconds to dry before applying the next one to slowly and gently build up the color gradation. After Sombre Grey, the next color I want to apply is Skeleton Bone, and I mix it with the previous grey to get more of a mid-tone kind of color. We want to avoid color transitions that are too stark, and so we cannot apply the bone color on directly. Instead, apply several thin coats, slowly building up the layers on the model but focusing on spraying the higher areas of the model to create a smooth transition. The next color we are working towards is Off-White, which is already a pretty bright white, so again we will mix it in with the previous color to manage the color transition. As we work toward the lighter colored layers, the areas you want to hit with the airbrush will gradually become smaller, focusing on the higher parts of the model so as to create shadows and depth. And with that last layer, we now have a pretty nice base color for white, and I want to move on to my final highlight using Ghost Grey, which happens to be the brightest white that I own. As we are delicately applying paint using tiny precise spurts, it's sometimes hard to see the paint flow, and I occasionally check the flow by spraying a burst of paint on my mat. For this final highlight, just focus on painting only the highest parts of the model and the extreme ends of the clothes.
I will keep that in mind. Anything else?
Now that we are done with the airbrush, you can see that we already have a pretty nice smooth white coat, but some of the detail has been covered, so we will need to add definition using the good old paintbrush. Firstly, I take Sombre Grey and create a light wash by watering it down significantly and applying it over the more intricately detailed portions such as the filigree on his cape. I also use the grey to create shadows in other parts of the miniature and further define the white detailing such as on his hood. Once the shading is done, we are going to add some of the brighter whites back and smooth out the transitions back up to the brightest white. Blending is a slow process because you need to give layers time to dry before you paint over it again. And that's why a wet palette is really useful for blending, as it allows you to adjust colors on the fly, giving greater control over the entire process. Finally, we will use Off-White to paint the final highlights on the model. I will only paint the highest points of the model such as the chest, the sleeves, the top of the hood, shoulders and cape as a spot highlight. I will also pick out the edges and all the clothing detailing like the filigree near the hem as well as the lines on his hood using flat lining to really bring out all that detail. And that's it for the white, and you can see how we've used the brush to obtain some greater definition and detail.
You done me good, brother.
Next we're gonna paint all the red details, and to start off we have Rhinox hide. With Rhinox hide we are going to paint all the red cloth as well as leather details such as the inner side of the cape, the belt sash, as well as the shoulder guards and straps, arm vambrace and boots. Brown is a great color to shade red, and by using a brown base coat it gives more depth and warmth rather than simply painting red over white or grey. Try to be as careful as possible to not mess up our previous white paint job and carefully fill in the color on all the details. With the brown base coat done, we are ready to build up our reds, and for this I mix Mephiston red with the previous brown to get a mid-tone as the first layer. I apply this mid-tone layer on the red portions, leaving brown in the deepest recesses and building up the color. It may take a couple of layers, but remember to wait for the previous layer to dry before applying the next layer. For the next layer, I will use pure Mephiston red to get that rich, vibrant assassin red. As before, we apply the layer on the highest parts, leaving a little of the previous layer showing underneath. Lastly, I use Evil Sunz Scarlet to really take that vibrancy to the next level. This may seem like a lot of steps, but as the details are really quite small, it really doesn't take too much time at all.
It is not any trouble. I have all the time in the world now.
Next, we are going to paint the black cloth areas, and we start with a base coat of Abaddon black. Using Abaddon black, we will paint the exterior of the kit to get that really posh two-toned look. I'm also going to have to paint in the leggings of the model, and this right here is a great example of how poor planning can make a paint job needlessly difficult. Remember to always try and paint from the inside out.
Good advice.
After the base coat, I add a little bit of Incubi darkness into the mix to do a little subtle highlight on all the black portions. Black can also be a difficult color to manage, and I like using soft and subtle highlights to try and keep it looking black as opposed to grey. It's time to paint in the skin tones, and as a base coat, I like to use Tuskgore fur. With this, we carefully paint in the hooded face as well as the neck and chest. Don't forget to also paint his two hands. Tuskgore fur is a medium brown with some reddish tones, which makes it a great shading color for flesh. Next, we are adding Cadian Fleshtone into the mix and building up the next layer for the flesh. Flesh areas tend to be quite small on miniatures, and it's easy to forget to allow the paint to rest before applying more layers. Overworking the paint before it dries can lead to frustrating results, and a good example is this mini I previously painted, which brings a whole new meaning to losing face.
Sempre come una donna per me.
For the final highlight, I use pure Cadian Fleshtone and paint the highest points on his hands and face, such as the tip of the nose and top of the cheeks. For such a small area, just a dot or two is sufficient on the extremities of the features. I'm also going to use a little bit of watered down black to paint in his manly stubble. Using a light glaze of black will allow you to have a natural finish where some of the skin can still show through. Once the skin is done, we will paint in the remaining red details on the mini, including the lapels inside his hood, as well as the accents on his right shoulder. It's easy to mess up here, but don't worry if you make a mistake, because it's easy to cover it up with a bold white highlight. And since I've got the white out, I take the opportunity to touch up all the other highlights on the model. Ezio is really coming together, and we are going to work on the leather parts next. For this, we start with Steel Legion Drab, and I will use stippling to apply some texture and highlights to the leather portions. For those who may not know, stippling is a technique where you apply tiny dots using a fine tip to create shading and texture. It's a great method for painting rougher textures such as leather. So you just paint where you would normally paint a highlight, but instead of a normal stroke, you can stipple on paint to emphasize the rough leather material. I do this for all the leather portions, including the vambrace as well as the boots, and once that's done, I add a little bit of Ushabti bone to the mix as a further highlight. This technique can be a little hard on your brushes, but it does help to build a very nice texture and can be a very useful alternative to dry brushing. Next, I'm going to paint the metal portions using a lazy non-metallic metal technique. First, I use some watered down black to paint in the metal areas to give it some definition. Painted over the white base coat, it looks just like a wash and serves to bring down the overall mid-tone colour of the metal areas. Between white, black and Incubi darkness, I play with the colour tones and slowly try to blend the colours to achieve a metal-like coloration. As these are relatively small details on the model with very simple shapes, it doesn't take very much to achieve a reasonable looking NMM effect. This is especially the case for the belt, where just a few simple dots are sufficient to give the illusion of reflection.
What sorcery is this?
All that's left is to touch up the brightest and highest areas of the model and also do up the base with our usual Ushabti bone and soft tone and green tone mix. With some quick black lining, Ezio is finally ready to join the fight. As this is a very special character, I've spent a little bit more time and effort painting him, but let me know in the comments if you think it was worth it. But if you're kind of feeling like this guy,
I'm not ready.
there is an easier way to paint white and you can check that out in my other video here.